Ahora vamos a proceder a la conferencia de clausura que, como han visto en el programa, va a correr a cargo del profesor Paul Vandenbroeck de la Universidad de Leuven, que nos va a proponer un tema tan sugerente como es la atribución de la comisión que está detrás de una de las obras más emblemáticas de la historia de la pintura occidental y, por supuesto, una de las grandes obras maestras del Museo del Prado, con el título de ¿Quién dijo que la persona que comisionó el Jardín de las Delicias fue un hombre? Paul Vandenbroeck se va a adentrar en este tema. Muchas gracias, Paul, cuando quieras.
Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Soy muy feliz de hallarme aquí al fin de este maravilloso coloquio en que he aprendido muy mucho y quisiera agradecer a la profesora Noelia García Pérez y al Museo del Prado para haberme invitado a dar esta conferencia. Había preferido dar en español, pero otras fuerzas han decidido de otra manera. Who said the commissioner of Bosch's so-called Garden of Delights was a man? ¿Quién ha dicho que el comitente del llamado Jardín de las Delicias del Bosco fue un hombre? Well, I've never been a champion in linear stories, so I start with an excursion. Please allow me. You know, there has been written an awful lot of books and articles on the so-called Garden of Delights. You also know this is not the original title, because we do not know if there was an original title. But in art historical literature, it is taken for granted, and you can read it dozens of times, that the British art historian Ernest Gombrich of the Courtauld, the Warburg and Courtauld Institute was the one who in 1967 who was the first to elucidate the history. Gombrich, who published an article in the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institute about the early history of the Garden of Delights. In fact, he was not the first, but it was a rather unknown professor from Belgium, Jan Karel Steppe, who worked a lot in the northern regions of Spain, where he was well known as Don Juan Carlos, no el rey emérito, who was the first to publish the early history of the Garden of Delights in a Flemish text in 1962. A text which was never translated, so he was in fact the one who found out that Antonio de Beatis in 1517 described the Garden of Delights in the palace of the Kouwenberg. It was the palace of the Nassau family in Brussels. So what I am going to say is not a proof in itself. It is based on 40 years of research, and only 3 years ago I managed to publish 2 books in English on exactly the iconography of the Garden of Delights. The first is titled A Suspect Paradise, Studies on the Left Panel, and detailed symbolism of the so-called Garden of Delights, Antwerp, 2018. The second one was published in Leuven in Leuven in 2017 under the title Utopia's Doom. I cannot translate doom correctly in Spanish. Doom is a very ambiguous word in English, and it has a connotation of, for instance, a dark cloud hovering over something or someone. Utopia condenada, sí, pero no es una traducción muy elegante. Utopia's Doom, the Graal as Paradise of Lust, the Sect of the Free Spirit, and Bosch's so-called Garden of Delight. So what I will say now are some conclusions to be found in those books. The present conference revolves around two issues, or a double issue. First, who commissioned the triptych? And second, what is the triptych about? And you all know that completely contradictory interpretations have been given. To some scholars, the central panel of the Garden of Delights is a depiction of sin leading to eternal damnation, which is represented on the right wing of the triptych, hell. To others, the central panel is a depiction of some kind of paradise. But if you go in detail, and you see there are hundreds of details, so it's, to put it popularly, a hell of a job to elucidate the meaning of the central panel. If you investigate it into detail, you will find out that a number of elements cannot bear a positive meaning, only had a negative connotation or meaning in Bosch's time. So, at the other hand, it is true that the iconography of the central panel reminds us of something of a paradise, an ideal state, an ideal existence. So, both statements are true. There is but one conclusion: it's a false paradise. And indeed, I give this as a conclusion of the research I mentioned a few minutes ago. The central panel represents a false paradise, which in Bosch's time was called Grail, in Espanol, El Grial. Now, we easily think of the concept of Grail as something from high medieval Arthurian literature, La Matière de Bretagne, in the 12th, 13th century. But the Grail I'm talking here about is a late medieval one, and in popular conviction in the late medieval times, the Grail was a kind of blissful paradise somewhere between earth and heaven, somewhere between the natural and the supernatural realms. I found some 50 allusions to this myth in 15th and 16th century texts from Germany and from the Low Countries. I will cite a few of them, well, partially. A German writer, Dietrich von Ihm, wrote in 1410, "Can it be true that many people live there and will continue to live until Judgment Day?" Point of interrogation. "They abandon themselves to fornication and pleasure and are eternally snared in diabolical delusions." A lexicon, a German Latin lexicon from about 1425, describes the word grail as, I translate, a mythical thing where many people live in physical pleasure until the day of judgment. Around half of the 15th century, this grail also started to be called the Mountain of Venus. The German writer Johann Nieder, in his Praeceptorium Divinae Legis, asked, I cite, whether there is any truth in what is told about the mountain or the realm of Venus, where one may indulge at will in iniquity and lust with the most beautiful of women. And the same writer also refers to those who walk to the gatherings of, he writes, Herodias, and the women who, I cite again, during the amber days, quatertemper, during the amber days, out of their senses, boasted of having seen heaven and the souls in purgatory. And I refer here to the wonderful book written by Cardinal Ginzburg about popular beliefs and practices in Italy in the late medieval times and early modern times. This myth was also well known in ecclesiastical circles. Many have written about it, some in doubt whether it could be true, others declaring it to be a popular fantasy. I mentioned Felix Faber, Bernhard Breitenbach, the well-known Sebastian Brandt, who wrote The Narrenschiff, La Nave de los Locos, and others. Another writer, Gert van der Schuren, who was secretary to the Duke of Cleve in Germany, wrote in 1478 that the Swan Knight, El Caballero del Cisne, came from, I cite, the earthly paradise that people call the Grail. And a contemporary writer, Johann Weldener, around 1480, wrote, I cite, according to old chronicles, the Knight of the Swan came forth from the Grail, which is the paradise on earth. And there are many, many others. It was also common belief that this paradise was to be found somewhere on earth, but possessing earthly as well as supernatural characteristics. And the people who were residing in it would believe in bliss, joy, and sexual pleasure until doomsday, until the day of the last judgment. And you all know, I suppose, Wagner's Tannhäuser. Well, Tannhäuser is the hero of the Grail, who was lost in the seemingly eternal joys of the Grail. Bosch, as everyone in the Low Countries and Germany must have known about this conviction. A paradise laying between earthly existence and the hereafter. And in fact, when we look at the central panel, we see a strange reminiscence of the adoration of the mystical lamb of the brothers Van Eyck. You see the 5 wonderful constructions with a fountain in the middle in blue and rosa colors, just like the 4 groups of saints approaching the mystical lamb in Van Eyck's painting. But there are, of course, many other details which have nothing to do with a celestial paradise. We know that this Grail, false paradise, was represented in Bosch's time, for instance, in the so-called Schimbartlauf. It was a kind of carnival pageant in Nuremberg, in Germany, where a number of parade floats were traveling through the city. And the Schimbartlauf represented, for instance, the paradise of Venus at the end of the 15th and the early 16th century. It is also true, we know from documents, that in documents in Low German language from the 13th to the 15th centuries, that the Grail was reenacted by, in a fantastical way, of course, was reenacted by citizens in several German towns, Magdeburg and Els, Brunswick, Celle, and so on. And although we are not currently aware of any visual depictions of the Grail, they must have existed. The French writer Antoine de La Salle wrote in his book Le Paradis de la Reine Sibylle, 15th century, that his own writings had been prompted by a conversation about a tapestry of the realm of the Sibyl. And the item in question was a tapestry belonging to Agnes of Burgundy, born 1407, died 1476, which did not survive. So, to keep things short, the central panel is a depiction of a false paradise in which people indulge in all kinds of physical pleasures, but only to be cast in hell at the end, as the right wing of the triptych makes clear. I quickly mention also something about the iconography of the left wing, earthly paradise. It is not the creation of Adam nor Eve. It is the blessing by God, represented as Christ, because no human person could see God unless under the appearance of Christ. It's the blessing of the first marriage. And when you draw the diagonal lines of the left wing, on exactly the cross point of the lines, there is a little owl in the center of the fountain. The fountain which is placed on a black heap, a dirty black heap, with gems and precious stones. And this is the real center of the left wing. And if we study the whole oeuvre of Bosch, we find out that the owl appears about 50 times throughout Bosch's oeuvre. It was a central symbol within his mindset. And you also see it's a small owl, una lechuza, a stone owl, hiding in the dark. And it is almost a depiction of a poem by Reinaissance poets in the 15th century. And I quote one couplet of a Reinaissance poem. I cite it in Middle Dutch. Gelijk die steenuils op den dag verbolgen, zo doen deze liefkens die niet een volgen, het huwelijk alzo het eerst was begonnen. For your convenience, I will translate it directly in Spanish. Como las lechuzas, odiando la luz del día, así hacen aquellos amantes que no siguen el matrimonio como fue concebido por Dios. Una referencia, a reference to what we see on the central panel. And if you take a closer look at the left lower corner, you see a few persons literally pointing at what we can see on the left wing, as if it were a justification of their behavior. Now, of course, we could go on for a couple of months on the iconography of the triptych, but I'm afraid we are at the end of the day, and you will not be willing to stay overnight here. So I must switch to the second theme of the conference, which you have read in the title. Who commissioned this enormous triptych, which, literally speaking, does not fit in the time schedule of this colloquium from Juana de Castilla, Esta, Clara Eugenia. And I must mention, I make another short excursion. Almost all art historians date this triptych to the end of Bosch's lifetime. So around 1500 or slightly earlier or slightly later. Here I want to mention a Dutch colleague, an art historian. His name is Bernard Vermet, who in 2001, together with a famous specialist in dendrochronology, Peter Klein from Germany, made a new examination of most available paintings by Bosch, and the dendrochronological data for the so-called Garden of the Lights was that the panels could be painted certainly as early as 1480 or even slightly earlier. So this is not a late work by Bosch, but a rather early one, not from his beginnings, but when he was about 30 or 35 years. And when Vermet remarked, when we compare the use of perspective in this triptych, we see some deficiencies, some shortcomings. We also find in other early works by Bosch, but not in the later one, as for instance, the Haywain, El Carro de Heno. So, what does this imply? Many art historians, knowing that the triptych was described in 1517 by Antonio de Beatis, took for granted that Henry III of Nassau was the commissioner. But if a late dating of the triptych is not correct, Henry III, Enrique III de Nassau, cannot have been the commissioner because he was born in 1483. So it must have been his uncle, Engelbert II of Nassau, born around the half of the 15th century and died in 1504. But what we know about the interests of Engelbert in art, well, we see that he was not interested in painting. He commissioned a number of precious manuscripts, chronicles, fanciful chivalric romances, mirrors for princes, books of hours, semi-fantastic histories of noble dynasties, and he also had a number of works from the library of the then deceased Philip the Good and Charles the Bold, Carlos el Temerario. And Engelbert himself also commissioned one precious manuscript of the Roman de la Rose, the well-known 13th century long poem written in French by two authors, which is in fact a kind of glorification of free sexuality and promiscuity. It's of a completely different tendency than, for instance, Bosch's triptych, which ends all in hell. So the manuscripts that Engelbert possessed were completely different and told different stories. What did Engelbert also commission? He was very keen on spending vast amounts of money on grandiose banquets, tournaments, festivities, and also he spent big money on buildings and on stained glass windows in important churches, where he had himself represented as the donor, as the commissioner. Now, what is proper to all his the artworks was that he always had his coat of arms, his blazon, depicted, be it in the manuscripts, be it in the stained glass windows, and always his coat of arms and his motto was present. We do not see any coat of arms on Bosch's triptych. The triptych has been examined by infrared reflectography and so on. There is no sign of any coat of arms. So, did Engelbrecht II of Nassau commission the triptych? Who was Engelbrecht of Nassau? The Count was what nowadays would be called a man's man, pugnacious. He was a warrior. He liked war, fights. He was a skilled soldier and also a keen military strategist. He was highly adept also in administrative matters, and he was unshakably loyal to his lord. First, the Emperor Maximilian I of Austria, and after him, Philip the Fair, Felipe el Hermoso of Burgundy. But above all, he was an incorrigible womanizer. It went so far. Now, of course, noble circles of his time were not holy examples of good marital behavior. There was a kind of promiscuity that was tacitly accepted. But Engelbrecht went so far in his behavior that he was 3 times publicly condemned at the chapter of the Order of the Golden Fleece, the Toison de Oro. So imagine one of the most powerful noblemen of the Netherlands was publicly corrected because of his unacceptable behavior. He had lots of mistresses, and he did not even try to hide his behavior. He was almost proud of it. And so no effort to conceal his way of life. So why would he have commissioned a painting in which such libertine behavior is castigated and ends in hell? This sounds really strange. Now, what do we know about Engelbrecht II further? He was married when he was still very young, in 1469, to a German noblewoman, Simburga von Baden, born 1450, died 1501, with whom he had no children. Now, it would be understandable if his behavior, which went on during his whole life, became too much for his spouse. And she must have led a very sad life. And we know that from manuscripts in her possession. In one book, she wrote in a kind of, in a language between Dutch and German. Dit boek hoort zu het Symbord van, that's Flemish, not van Baden, Grafin zu Nassau. And so this book belongs to Symburga of Baden, Countess of Nassau. And below we read a motto, which is also written in a mixed language of Dutch and German. Niet te maten is hem goed, der hemzelven troosten moet. Which means it goes not really well with one who must console himself. So a tacit complaint on Symburga's part. So might it, therefore, have been Symburga who, shocked by her husband's incessant, brazen, and universally known licentiousness, who commissioned the triptych? Could she have intended this immense work, which was impossible to ignore, either literally or figuratively, as a way of admonishing her husband's misbehavior in a grandiose manner and in effigie at their palace? Well, what do we know about Symburga? Not that much, but recently investigations have been done about her library. She possessed a number of manuscripts, as other noble women did, but among this is a woodcut of the Mountain of Venus, with in the middle two strange flowers which could be found, according to many texts, over there. A part of a French 15th century tapestry with an unknown iconography. Here we have our central panel, and now we go back to Symburga. Among her manuscripts, she had 3 texts about the Grail. These texts were first the text I translate in English, Daniel of the Flowering Veil, which is Tannhäuser, Daniel, by an author, a German author known as Der Stricker. His real name is unknown, a text written about 1220. Then the history of Melusine by Turing van Ringoltingen, 1456. And Hermann von Sachsenheim's Black Woman. The original title is Die Meurin, which can be translated either as La Morena or La Morisca. Now, these texts, what are they about? You know all the myth of Melusine, which has survived in a lot of versions. It's about a nobleman who marries a beautiful and seductive woman of unknown origin. And she has a secret. At certain moments, she turns into a mermaid, a siren, una sirena. And if her husband tries to see her in that appearance, she will disappear forever. It's in fact about an unequal marriage between a human being and a supernatural being. A marriage that is bound to contain secrets and taboos. And various noble dynasties in the Middle Ages chose exactly this myth as their origin saga. Now, the other text, Daniel of the Flowering Veil. Daniel is, as I said, none other than Tannhäuser, the knight who ends up in the realm of Venus, flees from it in remorse, travels to the Pope to seek forgiveness for his sin, but the pontiff plants a dry stick in the ground with the words, "When this dry stick blooms again, your sins will be absolved." Tannhäuser understands that his sins are unforgivable, returns to the realm of Venus, where he is doomed to stay until the day of the last judgment. That is the song of Lord Daniel. No one knows of a living thing crossing over those mountains. This is another representation of the Grail or the Mountain of Venus by Giovanni Bellini. Here we see our Engelbrecht II of Nassau. Here we see the tomb of Engelbrecht of Nassau and Simburga von Baden in Breda. We see how different they were. I return to our texts, and the third text by Hermann von Sachsenheim is a very long poem, extremely complex, very hard to understand, and it recounts in the first person the story of a married nobleman who is out walking in a beautiful spot. He is transported through the air by sorcery to the paradise of Venus, located at an unknown place in the world, where several races dwell. Well, Bosch depicted also black people and people of color. And the narrator of the story must appear before a court within the story to account for his deeds. And the judge turns out to be none other than Tannhäuser himself. Then there is a highly complex course of the trial, which we cannot follow in detail, it's too complicated. And the nobleman in question is has to do penitence, and this penitence consists of living in sensual delight with beautiful women. Completely paradoxical to the whole story. And the text ends, he returns home via the same magical route, and back home he recounts a highly selective version of his life and his adventure. Now, the entire text is marked by odd contradictions about sexual promiscuity, guilt, and penitence, consisting of committing the same sexual promiscuity again. And the text says, this Dit is der Welt lof. Esto es el tráfago del mundo. And remember José de Sigüenza, who around 1600 described the Garden of Delights with exactly the same word, the same expression. Now, Simburga had also another manuscript written around 1450 in Hagenau, in Alsace. And we see here an illuminated initial with naked protagonists making love between foliage or greenery, just as we see in Bosch's central panel. So this also was a manuscript belonging to Simburga, who, I recapitulate, possessed 3 texts about the Grail and also a manuscript dating from before Bosch, well, it's around 1450, which is a kind of forerunner of Bosch's inventions. Now, the following reading might therefore be possible. The triptych of Bosch, commissioned by Simburga, has been intended for the eyes of the Count of Nassau. It could not have been too revealing or too sharply critical. The central panel, as you know, shows a multitude of naked figures with no real attributes to identify them. The image is therefore universal and could apply to anyone. But anyhow, it ends all in hell, as the right wing makes clear. The content of the central panel would definitely not have been too offensive, therefore, to the eyes of Count Engelbrecht. Perhaps it was Simburga's way of encouraging her husband to change his lifestyle, with a link between his own lifestyle and that of the dramatis personae in the central panel, by no means cut and dried. As a conclusion, I can also say that the triptych cannot have been an altarpiece. It's common acceptance that triptychs stood on altars, that the triptych was an altarpiece with the shutters closed during weekdays and opened during festivities or Sundays. Now, this world-embracing story that we see with Bosch cannot have been an altarpiece, because an altarpiece always depicts a positive example, not an image of evil, however attractive it might be. And in fact, we know that the triptych of the Garden of Delights hung in the Palace of Nassau in Brussels above a chimney piece. So the chimney, the earth, was always an image, or a concentration image of the family, the marital bond, marriage. So it was not hung there by accident. We know of other paintings in the 16th and also in the 17th century representing scenes referring to marriage or the marital bond and placed exactly above a chimney piece. So this was an alternative reading of Bosch's Garden of the Lights. Again, the Garden of the Lights is a 20th century title, and it should have it should bear the name, the Triptych of the Grail, I think. And my hypothesis is that Symburga von Baden was the real commissioner behind this work. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias a Paul Vandenbroeck por esta tan reveladora charla. Hemos descubierto un motivo más para conservar una postal del Jardín de las Delicias siempre cerca. Bueno, además al profesor Vandenbroeck por su intervención, desde luego a todos los participantes que nos han expuesto sus tesis, que han intervenido con charlas tan sumamente interesantes, con estos debates, a todos los asistentes aquí y online, desde luego a todas las personas que nos han ayudado a llevar a buen puerto y realizar este simposio detrás de aquella vitrina, la puerta, las oficinas y demás. Gracias a todos. Larga vida al estudio del patrocinio femenino, y no solo el estudio, sino larga vida al patrocinio femenino, y hasta la próxima.